We have some breaking news for you. The jury in Rudy Giuliani's defamation trial has reached a verdict.
The jury has awarded two former Georgia election workers more than $75 million. CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson joins us now. Jessica, we are just getting this information in, even as we are speaking to you right now. But remind us of what this jury was actually deciding today. This was not a question of liability or guilt or innocence. They were simply looking at what damages to award these two.
That's exactly right. This was about reputational damages, emotional damages, punitive damages. Why? Because the judge already found that Rudy Giuliani had engaged in defamation. And so this was not about whether or not Rudy Giuliani had the requisite mental intent when he made a false statement of fact that harmed their reputation. This is about when he talked about these two poll workers and he made baseless accusations against them, how much were they harmed? Again, reputational harm, emotional injuries, punitive damages. And it really is just a question, frankly, I think, of how angry the jury is at Rudy Giuliani.
Well, based off of the numbers that we are seeing and that framework, it looks like the jury was very upset because Freeman had asked, as you mentioned, Jessica, there were different categories for these damages. The defamation, reputational harm, they had asked for almost 24 million and almost 25 million. On that, they were awarded a little bit less than they asked for, 16 million and 17 million. But it looks like on emotional distress and punitive damages that they received a total of, when you add it all together, a total of $148 million. Again, we are just getting this information in right now and trying to crunch these numbers ourselves. But what happens, Jessica, if Giuliani's not able to pay a sum that large?
And that's not unusual. I mean, look, this is an unusual case. We're talking about the former mayor of New York. We're talking about somebody who was the counsel to the president and a presidential candidate himself, engaging in defamatory statements and slandering poll workers who, let's remember, were there to count votes. So that is unusual. What's not unusual is for the jury to award verdicts that the plaintiffs will never see. And we see this in cases throughout the country where the jury will say $20 million or $30 million, and there's frankly no chance that the plaintiff will ever be able to recover. What it will do is set up essentially a payment scheme, and Rudy Giuliani will never become a wealthy person. Any money that he makes should go to making this verdict, to paying it towards this verdict and trying to make the plaintiffs whole. Now, of course, the amount of the verdict still could be downgraded, I believe, either by the judge or on appeal.
Remind us, Jessica, of the facts of the case. So we were talking about two poll workers, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, who testified in very emotional terms about the way they say their lives were changed profoundly as a result of the claims made by Rudy Giuliani. Tell us a bit about some of the testimony that we heard over the course of this.
The testimony we heard was really quite wrenching, and I think that's why you see these very high numbers from the jury. The testimony by the plaintiffs indicated that they were the victims of really a hateful digital mob, that people came to their homes, that they had trouble gaining employment, that they had to move, and that they were subject not just to hate, but to vile racist comments, and that they really were in fear of their safety. That it wasn't just, I can't believe people are saying this about me, but that one of the pieces of testimony that I remember is there was some discussion of hanging one of the plaintiffs, and she really thought that people were going to come for her, I believe the testimony was, and physically harm her. So this was not what people might come to expect on social media, a quote unquote typical trolling. This went far beyond that. And I think, again, that's why you see these high numbers here.
It does look like that number that I gave before is in fact correct. $148 million from this federal jury ordered of Rudy Giuliani to pay these two former poll workers who were defamed by the former personal attorney to President Trump. This is a unanimous verdict. It took them 10 hours, around 10 hours, to come to a conclusion. Since this is so different from many of the other trials that we cover in this case, because the judge had already ruled on it and the jury is coming up with the amount of punitive damages, was it necessary for it to be unanimous, Jessica?
I don't believe that it was necessary for it to be unanimous. We need unanimous verdicts when it comes to criminal trials because we are taking people's life and liberty away from them. We're putting them in jail. But when it comes to monetary damages, typically speaking, it does not have to be unanimous. I think they did want to come to, and it's a stronger statement, and it's more likely, I think, to be upheld when you do have a unanimous verdict in this case.
All right, if you'll stay with us for a moment, let's bring in CBS News Justice Department reporter Robert Legary in Washington. Tell us a bit more, Robert, as we've been going over the numbers here, and as you've been covering this story, what this case was really about and what this decision by this jury is intended, what kind of a statement is it intended to make?
Hey, that's right. Yeah, thanks for having me. So, you know, as the trial has gone on, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss's attorneys have said that this is not just about repairing their damage, but also about sending a message. And so that is why if you look at the breakdown of the damages here, we have compensatory damages, which make up $16 million for each on defamation of their reputation, $20 million for each on emotional distress. So what the jury found there was that was the amount of money, almost $75 million, that was owed Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss to make up for or to compensate for what the jury found that they went through. Now, they're also, Rudy Giuliani also has to pay $75 million in punitive damages, and that was the number that was really left up to the jury to decide how much to pay. And the reason that the plaintiff's attorneys said that they thought it should be a reasonably high number was to send a message. Here they said that ordinary people, civil servants like Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, should not be intimidated, threatened, have to face such vile, racist, violent language online because they partook in the civil process. And so they had to send a message there. Rudy Giuliani's attorney, however, said separate him from the conduct of people who heard his message and focus on, you know, what exactly is directly connected to him. And here, clearly, the jury wanted to send a message with over $100 million in damages.
All right, we want to bring into the conversation now CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane. He is also following this case for us from Washington. He joins us also on the phone. Just wanted to point out that that podium that you were looking at outside of the courthouse is something that we're continuing to monitor in case anybody does come out and decides that they want to speak, whether it is the two women who have now been awarded $148 million, or if it is the former mayor of New York City, Rudy Giuliani. We're going to watch that and bring that to you live as soon as that happens. In the meantime, Scott, you have been following all of this, and it's worth noting that these were two poll workers in Georgia. Giuliani faces separate criminal charges in Georgia, along with multiple co-defendants. Might the impact of this, $148 million in damages, awarded to these two poll workers, factor in at all to the overall case that is being made there in Georgia about Giuliani and his co-defendants' efforts to allegedly try and overturn a federal election?
Yeah, we're standing by waiting for Rudy Giuliani to exit the courthouse now. So pardon me as I keep an eye on him while I talk to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he is a co-defendant in Fulton County, make no doubt about that. He's also an unindicted co-conspirator in Trump's D.C. criminal case here in Washington, D.C. But this is a much different matter. This is a civil matter. And this jury took a day and a half to come up with this number, nearly $148 million, something Giuliani's team has already indicated they're going to appeal. But part of the argument the plaintiff's attorney made during closing arguments yesterday was that punitive damages, which are half of this award, are necessary to send a message that spreading conspiracy theories and lies and damaging, tarnishing, defaming ordinary people cannot happen. And the plaintiff's attorney argued, baseless claims persist. The instigators still instigate. This remains a risk as we enter an election year. One of my fellow reporters, Tom Jackman of the Washington Post, was watching Rudy Giuliani as the jury announced its verdict. Says Giuliani didn't make a face, didn't bat an eye. This dollar amount may not be a surprise to him, but this is an 8-person jury here in Washington, D.C., not criminal, so it's only 8 people. But these Washington, D.C. juries are coming from the same jury pool that has convicted 100% of the January 6th defendants to go to trial and now have towed a particularly hard line for election conspiracy lies told by Rudy Giuliani.
All right, Jessica Levinson, let me ask you a question about what Scott was just mentioning there and the idea of sending a message about the kinds of threats and claims that were made. What about that notion of sending a message about and having a deterring effect on others who may also be considering baseless claims or making such baseless claims? We are coming up on an election year. We know that there has been the specter of violence that has hung over civil servants, like the 2 in this particular case. What kind of message and what kind of overall bearing do you think does this kind of decision have on other officials or those who may be advising officials as they engage in political discourse in this upcoming year?
Well, there could be repercussions for defamatory statements. Now, heated political rhetoric is absolutely something that we protect and should protect. But there is a line that you can cross. And a judge, as we discussed, found that Rudy Giuliani crossed that line, that he engaged in defamatory statements and that it did, in fact, harm these people's reputations, and it harms them emotionally. And as we've talked about, that punitive damage award is really there to send a very strong message. I think the question about defamation is such an important question because as I talk about defamation law with my students and I talk about how it's in some ways in tension with the First Amendment because we do want this robust political discourse, I think what we're seeing is defamation law really is standing in as a way to protect people who are harmed by public officials who are engaging in disinformation and misinformation. Let's think back to even the E. Jean Carroll case, where she successfully sued former President Donald Trump for defamation. We can even think back to cases, not a public official, but a public figure, Bill Cosby, where he was sued for defamation because the statute of limitations ran on sexual assault in some cases. I think we're seeing defamation, particularly against public figures, playing a bigger role in our society, period. But to your point about going into an election, I think what we want to make sure is that people aren't chilled in their political speech, but that they do think twice before they make actively, like objectively false statements of fact about people that deeply harm them.
I want to bring back in Scott, and we're continuing to watch as we see people now starting to leave. It looks like that courthouse right now. Scott, we know you're going to bring us any of the latest as it comes out. Scott, though, one of the questions that I have for you, it seems like maybe we've lost Scott for right now, so I'm going to go back over to Rob Legary. But Rob, you've been covering this alongside Scott, so I think that the question's also particularly important to you as we see Rudy Giuliani now emerge from the courthouse. We're going to pause for just a second and see if he actually moves over here to the podium, what he might say, in part because he has been speaking outside of court recently, not backing down from those comments, those falsehoods that the judge said made him liable for $140 million. Let's listen.
Of course, there's very little I can say right now. I have to analyze this. Obviously, possibly we'll move for a new trial. Certainly we'll appeal. The absurdity of the number merely underscores the absurdity of the entire proceeding, where I've not been allowed to offer one single piece of evidence in defense, of which I have a lot. So I am quite confident when this case gets before a fair tribunal, it'll be reversed so quickly, it'll make your head spin. And the absurd number that just came in will help that, actually.
Why did you choose not to testify?
Why do you think it was unfair? We got to be saying it was an unfair tribunal. Why do you think it was unfair?
Because I cannot go into the details. I didn't testify because the judge made it clear that if I made any mistake or did anything wrong, she was considering contempt. And this judge does have a reputation for putting people in jail. And I thought, honestly, it wouldn't do any good.
Do you still believe that what you said about these two women in the wake of the 2020 election was truthful?
Do you still believe these claims?
Do you still believe those
I have no doubt. I have no doubt that my comments were made and they were supportable and are supportable today.
Still.
I just did not have an opportunity to present the evidence that we offered. Did you notice we were not allowed to put in one piece of evidence in defense? Do you also realize that liability is not based on any trial? Liability is based on her disagreement with me on discovery, which is absurd.
Why didn't you take a stand?
We gotta go.
Because I believe the judge was threatening me with the strong possibility that I'd be held in contempt or that I'd even be put in jail. So it didn't seem like it was going to do much to persuade anybody, and it could give her what she seemed to be threatening.
Did you believe the women's
Do you have any regrets about
That's all I have to say. I have
any regrets about some of the comments that the women received?
Hey, we gotta get going.
Do you have
Always
any
work.
regrets about some of the comments that the women received?
Well, of course, the comments they received I had nothing to do with. Those comments are abominable. They're deplorable. No defense to it, but I receive comments like that every day. Different kinds of things. I've represented clients who have gotten that from the other side. This is a terrible part of our political system. Republicans, Democrats, liberals, and conservatives all get that. My comments weren't that. And I think that was also a very unfair part of it because my comments had no connection at all to those. There were thousands of things on in the press about this, of which mine were a small amount. There's no way to say that my comments connected to that, but that's going to be part of what we'll get to litigate in a fair court. Thank you.
Is that behavior that you will officially condemn, sir?
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
There we heard Rudy Giuliani once again, and rather than getting into the comments he made before, which is what I was going to ask you guys about, let's talk about what he just said. Jessica Levinson, he made some allegations against the judge, against the process. He said the judge was threatening me and he was not allowed to present any evidence. Is there any validity to what he was saying, Jessica?
No, there's not. I think what he's arguing here is that he wasn't allowed to relitigate the case after the judge had already found him liable for defamation. He was alluding to something, and I think it was a little bit confusing maybe, but he refused to give over discovery in this case, and the judge found against him and found that a jury could infer that he was hiding something. He was asked and given many opportunities to provide evidence, and the reporting indicates that he provided none of that evidence. I also think we really
So wait, Jessica, I just want to pause there and make sure that we're putting this into terms that our viewers all understand. So earlier when the judge was deciding on the merits of whether or not there was defamation, Giuliani and his legal team were asked to provide evidence. They declined to do so at that point. And so when Giuliani's saying she wasn't allowing me to present evidence, it was during this phase, which was deciding how much he would have to pay, not on whether or not he was liable. Am I getting that all right?
So I have to tell you from his comments, I'm not sure what he was referring to in the sense of she wouldn't let me put on a defense, because he absolutely was not just allowed to, but was asked and required to provide evidence during that first phase, which, Lana, you very correctly made a demarcation as to whether or not he would be liable. There was an opportunity to provide evidence. He declined that opportunity. But then in this second phase, which, as we've been talking about, is all about whether or not or how much he will have to pay, he opted not to take the stand. He opted to give no defense whatsoever. And so to the extent that he is upset with the number, which any person can imagine he would be, he did not try to change that in the courtroom. And the last thing I was going to try and emphasize is we have to, in all these cases, focus on what people say outside the courtroom when they're not under oath, when they're not facing the penalty of perjury, and what they say when they're on the stand, and or if they decide to say nothing at all.
And Jessica, he also said at one point, speaking of the kind of criticism and the vitriol that these two poll workers faced and his own comments. He said, well, the comments they received, I had nothing to do with. My comments had no connection at all to that. Remind us of what the judge found in this case.
Well, the judge did not find that. Now, it is absolutely the case that people are not responsible when they make a comment. They are not responsible for every action that people take as a result of those comments. But what we're talking about here is Rudy Giuliani saying in public forums, saying to the public, these two people engage in election fraud. Rudy Giuliani is a public figure. He has a bullhorn. When he speaks, people listen, and people decided to take actions, as a result of that. And that's what the judge here found, that those actions were foreseeable as a result of his statements.
Jessica, you get a drink of water. I'm going to bring our viewers back up to speed on what we have just learned. So there is now a decision in the Rudy Giuliani civil defamation trial. He is on the hook for $148 million for the comments that he made against two poll workers in Georgia, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, a mother-daughter team who they say had just tried to do their civic duty by working on election day. And as a result of allegations that Giuliani made that they were working to steal the election, they received death threats. They received racist comments. We just heard from Giuliani a moment ago where he said those comments were deplorable, but claimed that he had nothing to do with them. So hearing him say all of these things, a landmark decision, really $148 million in a verdict that is likely going to have repercussions not only for other people who are making comments, but also as we head into this election season. I want to ask you, Jessica, about that number, that $148 million, because that included $16 million to Freeman, who had asked for $24 million in reputational harm, $17 million for Moss, who had asked for $25 million in harm. And then the rest of it, the emotional distress, the punitive damages, that was all left entirely up to the jury. Giuliani just now said that that was an absurd number. He repeated that phrase, absurd number, and said that he thought that that would actually help him as he went on appeal. Might it help him? Jessica?
Would that number potentially help him on appeal? I think the answer is probably not, because of what we talked about in the sense of the punitive damages. And they not only are aimed at telling Rudy Giuliani, don't do this again, they're also aimed at other people and trying to act as a deterrent. Now, is that the place where I think it is most likely that a judge could bring down the award? Absolutely. But the sheer number doesn't necessarily make the verdict subject to being overturned or reduced. But that is just typically speaking in cases, the punitive damage award, if a jury is angry, they go big. And that is the place where not just in this case, but in other cases, we see judges bring that number down. So let's not be surprised if we see that here.
Do we have any sense right now, Jessica, I'm just curious, of a time frame of how an appeal could play out? Because as we've been talking about here, campaign 2024 is in full swing. We are at a moment when we know there has been so much scrutiny on the language used, on the way in which characterizations are made of people who are performing these kinds of civic duties. There is a lot of scrutiny surrounding how leaders and advisors to leaders are talking about our political processes in this country. Do we have a sense, could it be that we would see this come to another sort of head legally at a time that could be particularly critical during the 2024 election cycle?
Yes. I mean, I would say this is already a particularly critical time when it comes to poll workers and election workers and what they're thinking could happen to them. I started my career in part working in election law and voting rights, and I still speak sometimes to people who work in this space. And I will say that the election administration community is concerned, and they're concerned about exactly what happened in this case, which is you have a public official who makes a statement, and it's an allegation that goes to the heart of somebody's integrity and credibility and ability to perform their jobs. And it can really stay with somebody for a very long period of time. And it can not just subject them to threats, but it can subject them to fear of reprisal in their workplace. It can subject them to responses socially and professionally. All of which is to say, when we're thinking about public officials making statements about people who are counting votes and trying to make sure that votes are fairly tabulated, these are almost exclusively private figures who do not have the bullhorn, who can't grab a microphone the way the public officials do. And so that's in part why defamation law is structured the way it is. But I would say we're at that critical moment where, of course, we need to be able to criticize the government, including poll workers if they do something wrong. But we see how very dangerous it can be to make baseless accusations against them.